Hello, my name is Alyssa Jean, and I am a student in the Spring 2019 Global Environmental Health class taught by Jack Caravanos. Today, we will be talking about lead poisoning in Zamfara, Nigeria. So, in this presentation, I will be shining a light on Zamfara, Nigeria, and its lead poisoning crisis that occurred in 2010. Together, we will learn about the devastating effects of lead and what it did to the population of Zamfara. So here we just have a table of contents, trying to serve as a guide for what we'll be talking about in this presentation today. So first I'm just going to talk a little bit about Zamfara, Nigeria, just so we can get an idea of, the location that we're speaking of. So Zamfara is a state in northwestern Nigeria, as you can see in the bottom picture that's highlighted in the dark orange. That is Zamfara. It is populated by the Hausa and Fulani peoples, and that's basically just to give you a little bit idea of the culture of Zamfara, Nigeria. Um, there are specific languages and culture associated with Hausa and Fulani peoples. It's typically, a tropically warm climate. Temperatures can reach to as high as 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So it can get very hot. And the estimated population, according to the 2011 census, is 3 million. So, the topic of this presentation is lead poisoning in Zamfara, Nigeria. So, what is lead? Lead is a naturally occurring element, so it can be found on the periodic table, and it can be found in all parts of our environment. It can be especially toxic to humans and animals, and can cause irreversible damage and even death if blood levels get too high. Children are especially at risk for a variety of reasons. One being that they absorb lead more than adults do, so a certain amount of lead in a child may not be as detrimental to that same amount in an adult. In addition, their developing brains are much more sensitive to the effects, to the damaging effects of lead. So that kind of goes along with what I just said before. For someone whose brains are already developed, they may not be as sensitive to the negative effects of lead. So here is a chart that I made, and it's just to give an idea of like the usage of lead and how much we produce it, or how prevalent it is or important it is to us. So we are going to be talking about 2010. So our first plot point right here shows us that the lead production in 2010 was 45 tons. So yeah, that's just to give a little idea of the world the world usage of lead. So what exactly happened? How did lead poisoning come about in Zamfara, Nigeria? So there was a time where large amounts of lead were being introduced to Zamfara through artisanal gold ore processing. What would happen is that men would bring rock ore to villages, and women would then grind it into fine particles. Now, you may know that when things are grinded into fine particles, it's much easier for them to be dispersed throughout the environment. But we're going to talk about that a little bit in the next few slides. Anyhow, as a result, lead was excessively dispersed throughout the villages of Zamfara, reaching concentrations reported at 100,000 parts per million, when the standard is actually 400 parts per million. So you can see how large of a gap that is. Below, I made a table of gold ore processing activities in villages during the previous 12 months of, the crisis. So you could see that breaking rock served as 69% of the activities um, of the gold ore processing throughout the villages. So yes, the parentheses serve as the percentage of the gold ore processing activities throughout the villages. So if we look carefully, we can see that washing is really one of the largest activities in gold ore processing that could have caused this epidemic. So this spatial graph kind of just gives us an idea of the distribution of lead through Zamfara, specifically in children, though, because we will be talking about children in the next few slides. They took blood samples of children under 5 years old um, in different villages. So basically, Zamfara state is divided into 14 local government areas, which contain multiple villages under its jurisdiction. So if you look at the map, you can see the dark circles is where the blood levels were the highest, with a value of greater than or equal to 45 grams per deciliter. And so then the lighter gray circles are the second less high, and then the white circles are the lowest with 10 grams per deciliter. Now, 10 grams is supposed to be the standard, so anything above that um, should be a cause of concern. When Doctors Without Borders, an organization of doctors dedicated to serving communities in need, reported an excess of childhood death, we had to figure out what was happening. In Zamfara, more than 400 children under the age of 5 years old had suddenly died, and 100 plus children had serious acute and long term irreversible health effects. Now, you may wonder how these numbers got so high and so quickly. If you remember earlier, we were talking about the ore being ground down into fine particles. This allows for the expansion and the dispersion of lead throughout the community in a variety of ways. Children were likely to have ingested this lead through the consumption of contaminated foods, the ingestion of contaminated water, the accidental ingestion of soil and dust, and of course the contaminated dust with the lead that is what caused the contaminated food and the contaminated water. 100% of children in all of the villages tested a level higher than 10 grams per deciliter, with levels as high as 700 grams per deciliter. This is astounding, as the international standard is 10 grams per deciliter. So, now that we have the problem, what are we going to do about it? Doctors Without Borders offered chelation therapy. Chelation therapy basically binds to the toxins in the bloodstream by circulating a chelation solution. This removes heavy metals from the body, and which allows critical lead levels in children to be lowered. This was not enough, though. If a child received chelation therapy just to go back into the same environment, then they would be recontaminated and lead levels would rise again. Therefore, children were prohibited from re-entering contaminated spaces. These environments were to be fixed through the removal of topsoil and thorough removal of dust from all interior spaces. This had to be done quickly, as you may imagine, it is not easy to live somewhere that is not your own village. So here is just a quick bar graph showing the percentage of mortality rates in children younger than 5 years old before and after chelation therapy. So before therapy, we can see that the mortality rate in children under 5 years old was 43%. After therapy, we can see that the mortality rate in children was just 2%, showing a drastic decrease in mortality rate and showing the effectiveness, of chelation therapy. So, what can we learn from this? We know that the introduction of lead to humans can cause irreversible damage and even death. In Zamfara, Nigeria, an excess of childhood deaths occurred from an outbreak of lead poisoning. Chelation therapy served as an intervention to decrease lead poisoning in children, and the re entering of children to their normal environment was prohibited until deemed safe. When crises such as these occur, it is pertinent that action is taken quickly and swiftly. Here are just references that I used to do this presentation. I hope that you enjoyed and I hope that you learned something. Thank you and have a good day.